Good afternoon. My name is Jono Thompson. I'm a trainer based in the UK, and I'm going to talk about how we look and secure our networks from the inside. Having worked on a few projects and seen some networks taken down from things on the inside, we're very good at our firewalls on the outside, so I'm going to look at what we can do that. Okay, I work for a company called ITX. We're a distributor in the UK, and we deliver training. I've been in this industry some 20-something years, with most of that time focusing on networking, router OS, for some 15 years now, and a trainer and consultant. We're just going to look at, this afternoon, some of the components of 1X, look very briefly at the configuration on router OS, and I'm going to do what they tell you not to do in a presentation, and attempt to do a demo and show it connect. I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine called Mike. I've met Mike many years ago, and I think I've talked about some of the conversations we've had over the years. Some 5 years ago, we were talking about the configuration he'd done installing his new switches using his VLANs, and his network has massively improved since deploying VLANs. But Mike, having had some thoughts about security, he came in the office one day and he saw somebody just sitting there with a laptop just plugged into the network. He'd unplugged somebody else's computer and plugged it in. Now, he didn't recognize this person, but in this day of a lot of hybrid working and people coming in and out, he wasn't sure whether this person was actually supposed to be there and or a member of staff or not. And it had him thinking, do I need to do something to make my network more secure from the inside? Because when we go on training courses and we do presentations, we always show that the people that we don't like on our network always wear hats. But in the real world, they don't sit there wearing a mask and a hat in your office. Mike also discovered and realizing that staff are bringing their own devices in because they wanted to. And he doesn't know whether they are compliant, they have antivirus set up or properly on them, and he was getting a bit concerned about what might happen, having heard stories of other people's networks being taken down from the inside. So, like Mike seemed to do quite regularly when he has problems, he has a really good friend called Dave. And Mike rang his friend Dave and had a chat to him. And Dave, being the wise guy that Dave is, suggested that Mike should look at, with his lovely MikroTik switches, that he could use a MikroTik feature called .1x. MikroTik's .1x function is a direct implementation of the standard of 802.1x, and 802.1x defines port-based authentication. .1x is not available, just so you're aware, on router boards with the SMIPS hardware, the same limitation we have with User Manager. What can 1x do? It can do a lot of things, and I'm going to talk through some of the things that Dave and Mike talked about and deployed. We can authenticate an interface, we can put in a specific VLAN, and we can provide some dynamic switch-based rules. Like with a lot of really good technologies, we implement or define new terminologies. And 802.1x defines 3 components. The supplicant, which would make more sense to call a client, an authenticator, which is the device that you're trying to get on the network via, whether that be a switch or a wireless access point. And then we need something to apply the authentication against. it defines it with the terminology authentication server, which is a radius server. As well as the supplicant or the client, it's normally a laptop, desktop, but it can also be routers. And MikroTik Router OS has the functionality to be a 1x supplicant or a client to 1x. And nowadays, a lot of printers and IP phones also support 1x functionality. And if you're using Router OS gives it a slightly more helpful name. In my name call, they call it a 1x client, because it is the client. The authenticator is the device that is controlling access to the network, a switch, or an access point. The authenticator needs to verify the identity of the supplicant, the client trying to connect, and it uses information from the authentication server to decide whether that is going to happen. The authenticator needs to have a radius client set up on it to communicate back to the radius server. The authenticator decapsulates what we call the EAP messages coming from the client, which will be encapsulated in Ethernet, and de-encapsulates them and then re-encapsulates them as radius to go to the authenticator server. And Router OS can be an authenticator on the switch as well as on the wireless access point. And you can run it on all the interfaces or many interfaces, whichever interfaces you want to run it on. Just as a points of technical for running on MikroTik, if you are using 1x on bridge ports, which is the way I would normally run them, you need to be running rapid spanning tree so that the EAP packets are correctly processed. And nowadays, by default, a newly created bridge will have that anyway. It's only if you are adding this into an old setup that might be an issue. Once that port is set up as to run as a 1x server port, it will block all traffic apart from what we call EPOL, or the EAP over LAN packets coming in, and there will be no access by default. Once that port has been authenticated, it will allow all traffic on that port. So if you have authenticated with an IP phone, then the port in the back will carry the same authentication. MikroTik Router OS switch does not support what some vendors call multi-host support, where it authenticates each device separately by MAC address. It unlocks the whole port for everything on it. So if you've got another switch in between, something just to be aware of, that it will let everything through. So Mike thinks this is all well and good, and he starts to look at the devices he's got dotted around his office, and he discovers that he's still got some very old printers that don't support 802.1x. So as he doesn't know what to do, he rings Dave again. And Dave explains to him that you can also run MacAuth. So not only can we use username and password authentication, we can also use radius to dole out and authenticate devices by MAC address as well. And since more recent versions of Router OS, from when the first implementation was this, they now give you various controls of username and password, so that it will support with many different radius servers, because some have parameters and requirements to send MAC addresses and passwords in specific formats. And MikroTik now supports many formats. And Mike thinks this is all well and good, but actually, we do need some ports in our meeting room for people to plug in stuff for demo purposes. Sometimes people are fine using the Wi-Fi, but they are bringing kit in for demo that needs to be plugged in. And Mike also worries what's going to happen if my radius server is down. Is it going to prevent all my staff from working when one of my infrastructure goes offline? So again, he rings Dave. And Dave, still been quite gracious at this point, giving Mike lots of help, explains that there are additional features in 1x. And we have additional features in the authenticator that we have a setting that we can set what happens if the server is down or unreachable, or the client does not support 1x, or the client puts the wrong password in. And they are in the format of here. There is a reject VLAN, which is used if somebody doesn't have their correct credentials, or like users so commonly happen, they forget their passwords or they can't type them in right. So you could put them in a limited access VLAN, so at least they could do some work until you're able to remind them or reset their password. Though it does show in the status, which is slightly confusing when you first look at this, is that even if you have failed to authenticate, it does show the port as authorized, because it has been authorized in the reject VLAN. It takes a little bit of getting your head around, because it has to be authorized to pass the traffic, but it has put you in the reject VLAN. There is also another parameter for guest VLAN. This is for devices that don't attempt to initiate the 1x because they don't support it, or it has been disabled on the device. And they will just put them in if it fails for 3 timeout periods to start the 1x process, and you can put them into the guest VLAN, and again, they are shown as authenticated in the guest VLAN. And then finally, the third option that MikroTik give us is a server fail VLAN, and this here is if the radius server fails to respond within the timeout period, and will put you in the server fail VLAN, so that you could have device clients still working with potentially limited access while if you have infrastructure issues or you're using a remote radius server. And again, I didn't mention these on the last 2, but to use these VLANs, you need VLAN filtering running on your BRID ports. You can set a reauth time, and this is the time that the authenticator will make the client reauth it's using its credentials at. If you're changing settings quickly or whatever, this will make the clients reauthenticate at a time interval. Now, Mike thinks, great, I can secure my ports. My guests can connect if they need to use a wire. But Mike also notices that these days, because he's not always in the office, people are picking up their computers and deciding they want to move to any desk they like in the office. And then he's discovering that we're getting people in the wrong VLAN. We've got the sales guys and the admin in the accounts VLAN, and they're not getting to the systems they want to. And I'm thinking, Mike's thinking, nah, I don't like this, and it's creating me a lot of work, also changing VLANs on the ports. So Mike rings Dave to try and find a solution. Dave, still being very helpful and gracious to Mike and giving him some answers, but he reminds him that 802.1x can also assign VLANs based on a user. And Dave also explains that there are dynamic switch rules that MikroTik can create from the radius credentials of a user to make ACLs on the switch port dynamically when a user connects if required. So, port-based VLAN assignment. 1x assigns this authenticated user into a dynamic VLAN, and it's used by these 3 radius attributes, which are supported standard attributes. And if you want to use dynamic switch rules, you need a switch that supports ACLs. You need to be aware of the limitations of the switches on the maximum number of ACL rules, and those rules are dynamically created when the client session is active, and they disappear when the interface goes down and the client disconnects. And it's done by using a radius attribute that's custom to MikroTik called switching filter. Rules need to have an action. If you don't put an action, the default of allow applies. You can chain multiple rules together in the attribute by using a comma. And just like with the MikroTik firewall filter, the default action at the end of the chain is allow. So if you are allowing a specific then you'll need to end this dynamic switch rule attribute with the action of drop at the end. Otherwise, your rule is still letting everything through. Number of parameters are supported: map protocol, source address, source MAC address, destination, source IP address, and ports, ranges, source and destination port. If you've used the ACL rules on MikroTik, you have to have a port, but that is dynamically created based on the port that the client is connecting on. And if you leave the source MAC address unpopulated, it will dynamically populate that from you based on the client connecting. And there is an example of a dynamic switch rule that is just going to allow Winbox, TCP 8291, and a DHCP to obtain an IP address, so UDP 69, and then drop everything else on the port. So from that port, with that rule, you will get an IP address and only be able to Winbox to devices on any device at the moment there. So Mike thinks all great, and then he starts reading about EAP types, of which there are many. And again, he rings Dave for some advice. And Dave just explains to him that if you are using a MikroTik 1X client as a client, then MikroTik support 4 EAP types. And as a starting point for Dave's understanding on EAP types. So the EAP types that if you are using the MikroTik as a client to connect to a 1X protected network, the EAP type defines how the authentication is going to do and the security of the credentials being passed. So the authenticator, as mentioned, this takes the frame and relays them to the authentication server. It takes the Ethernet header off, and then the remaining EAP frame is re-encapsulated in radius as it passes through. The authenticator does not modify or examine those EAP. So the switch doesn't look at for the username and password, it was just passing it through as it goes. MikroTik Router OS clients support EAP TLS, EAP TTLS, EAP MS Chat v2, and PEEP EAP MS Chat v2, which is the most common one used also on Windows clients by default. If you're using EAP TLS, you need both sides to have a certificate. This requires some form of certificate management system or an MDM system, otherwise you are chasing certificates around. It's the most complicated to deploy and set up, but it's probably one of the most secure as we've seen already this morning, that certificates are much harder to crack than passwords. EAP TTLS is a tunneled transport security layer. Only the server needs a certificate, and then it uses that certificate to authenticate the client. EAP MS Chat v2 is the Microsoft one that's most used with Windows. However, MS Chat v2, as I hope you're fully aware, is not secure these days. And then, as you'll see in a moment, that MS Chat v2 is normally used as an inner layer to something with a TLS tunnel, and this is the one that most people tend to deploy these days. It is PEEP EAP. So we have an outer tunnel which is a TLS tunnel, requires a certificate, and then it uses MS Chat v2 inside that TLS tunnel to keep your credentials encrypted and secure. I'm not going to talk about the certificate part of it today, because we could spend all day going through self-signed and signed certificates and the deployment of those. There is a guide in the MikroTik documentation on certificates in Router OS. So Mike thinks, great, okay, I've got a bit of a feeling of what I'm doing, I understand my EAP types, I know what EAP types I should be using and which ones to avoid because they're going to be a lot of work. But then he says, but radius. Now radius is big and scary. I've heard all these people tell me how difficult free radius is to set up. And then I'm going to need a server. I don't have any servers because I've moved everything to the cloud. And I've got rid of all my tin because it was costing me money. So Mike rings Dave. And Dave suggests to Mike, you should just look at MikroTik's user manager. It is a radius server, and it will run on the MikroTiks that you've already got without you needing to buy any more servers. And this is what our radius server needs to do. This is providing the authentication of the supplicant. It stores the user credentials, and then it will send back any additional parameters of VLAN or switching filters back to the device. And this is radius. MikroTik User Manager is a very good radius server, especially on version 7. It's very easy to configure. If you are running version 7, you need to install the additional package of User Manager, and in 7.18, it is even easier because the package lists show you the additional packages. You can just enable it. You no longer need to download that extra zip file and copy the package across to your router. Your radius server, if you don't want to use it there, doesn't have to be in the same VLAN. You can run it remotely. You could tunnel it to a third-party radius server, but you need to remember that radius communications are sent in the plaintext. So you either need to send it through a secure tunnel if you're tunneling it over the internet, because some organizations want centralized radius servers, or you could use RadSec and MikroTik Router OS clients on your switches will support RadSec to connect to a server supporting RadSec. If you are running remote servers over tunnels, you may need to increase the radius timeout setting to allow the time for those radius packets to get to the received radius server and back. Otherwise, you'll end up with a lot of failed authentications because they have timed out before the radius packets return. Mike thinks, great, solve that. I don't want to use certificates because I don't want to have to set up MDM management of all my devices. I don't want to deploy certificates, but he's also heard that passwords and usernames are not that secure. So, as we heard this morning from Mikhail, we can use the one-time password, and since his presentation this morning, we've actually tested it and it works, and you can see that in a moment. And he rings Dave. Dave suggested looking at user manager supporting the one-time base password, and it works alongside MikroTik's 1x implementation. Dave goes ahead, sets it all up. No, Mike sets it all up, following Dave, mixed up there. Mike sets up all, following Dave's advice. And lo and behold, he has some problems. And he has some problems getting some users' devices to actually connect. So Mike rings Dave. Dave, by this point, is getting sick of these phone calls. And we've all got friends like Mike who we just wish sometimes would look up the answers themselves before asking. But Dave still tells him that you've forgotten to look at the logs. The logs in MikroTik Router OS are incredibly powerful and show you a lot of what is going on. Dave, trying to get rid of Mike by this point, suggests that he probably should go on some training, and suggests that he looks at the MikroTik switching engineer training course. So, where and what do we do when it goes wrong? And this is what Dave suggested. If you look at radius debug logs, those logs show you the packets coming back to do the authentication. And there's a lot we can glean from these logs. So we send an access request. This access request from the port is going to the radius server. And what have we sent? We have sent the calling station. This is the NAS. This is the called station is the authenticator, and the calling station is our client. So we've got the MAC addresses. So we can check that it's the right device and find it in the logs. we can see the username that has been sent. We can't see the password, but we can see the username that has been sent. And we can see the port that they are plugged into on the switch, either 8 on this particular example, and we can see the identity as well of the device. We know that they're not only the port they're on, we know what device they're connected to, and the IP address of the device in question. And then we will get back, hopefully, if it is all working, an access accept message back from the radius server. And in here, we can see that the tunneled private group ID is the VLAN it's going to put the client into. So you can check that it's actually doing what you want it to do. So if you're in the wrong VLAN, you check that that's what's going on. You see what you've sent back. You've also got the status on the authenticator. Remember that authorized doesn't necessarily mean they've got the right username and password, but you can also see on the active the username they have used, the client MAC address, and the VLAN you have put them in. So, I'm not going to step through and explain every part of the config. When the PowerPoint gets uploaded with the videos at the end, there will be a proper step-by-step guide, because we have just altered and added in the time-based settlement, and we'll put that into the PowerPoint to show you all the config I did to make that work. So we've got a very simple setup. I've got a 1X client. I've done most of the config using the MikroTik, because we're here to talk about MikroTik, so not talk about Windows or Mac OS or Linux or other operating systems. We've got a MikroTik switch, a CRS switch. They're running VLAN filtering, set up, hardware offloaded in the normal setup way that we do, and then we're running User Manager. So User Manager, we've enabled User Manager after putting the package on. The step I tend to forget. You think, why isn't User Manager running? You've got to actually go into the settings and tick the enable box. That's the key one I always seem to forget. And then we have to set a router up, which is the device that's going to connect in, give it a password. I do suggest that you possibly use slightly more secure passwords than I have shown in the example, because may possibly get hacked. And then we've created a user, and this is where you set the additional attributes. And with User Manager now, the attributes are all there on the pull down. So you don't have to type in the attribute details, you put them in and you put the values in, and you'll see there that I have put tunnel group ID of 199 to put it into VLAN 199. And if you are using the switching filter, you select the attribute of MikroTik switching filter, and there you type in a large amount of text. You might find it easier to create that text in some form of text editor where you can actually view it easier and paste it across, because that is not a very big box to type a lot of information into. And then you need to create a radius client on your switch, point it to your radius server, set the timeout dependent on how far away your radius server is, so it will work. And then bridge, ports, create two of your VLANs, and then create 1X on your VLANs. And if you are going to use the reject VLAN, the guest VLAN, or the server fail VLAN, then you'll set those up at this point. And then if you are using MikroTik client, you need to select the types for it to use. Other operating systems work differently. And if you're going to create, and I've done a different client connecting with our ACL username, which will show possibly what happened. It should just pop up. Yes, it does. Great. So if I type my username in, put my password in, and then because I have set up the time-based passwords onto my authenticator app, and I add in the end my 6-digit code, so it's a one-time connection, and you will have a device that has now obtained an IP address. And then if we look on, that's the radio server. If we look on the switch, you can see, if I zoom in a bit on that, you can see that the port is authenticated. It's been put in VLAN 199, and that's the username that's come. If we look in our bridge, we'll see that the port has been put into the VLAN dynamically by PVID, because that PVID is applied to the port by the 1X profile. So that's that there is 802.1x port control. I do blog occasionally. We have a blog as a company. That's our blog, blog.linearitx.com. I do write technical articles occasionally. As I'm working on this stuff, there'll probably be some articles on this in the days to come as I get time to actually write. So that leaves me to say, is there any questions?
No questions? Wow. Oh, yeah, we have one.
Is there some feature in MikroTik that you could utilize to only allow one MAC address per port?
If you look in the... So this is slight limitation on the CRS 300 series. The older CRS 100, 200 series switches had an amazing feature set on them to allow one or number of MAC addresses per port, to limit by MAC address. That feature is not on the CRS 300 series for whatever 500 newer range, though you can access it on the device that the dual boot to switch onto SWOS has it in there. So I can only hope one day they might implement it. There is a guide on the wiki of how to create rules to limit that one MAC address when connecting. The ACL rule that you create if you put the switching filter does dynamically take your source MAC address from the device. So theoretically, you could just create everyone to create a dynamic rule to allow based on the source MAC address that you're connecting on, would possibly a way to look at that. I might test that and add it to the presentation if it works. So thank you. I'll look at that, but I think that should work. On the fly, thinking.
It should. Other questions? No more? So thank you, Jono, for your beautiful presentation, as usual.